going to ask you a random question, which is when you think about your role as a dad, what are the parts you love the most?
Oh man. That's a deep question to start with.
Yeah, you know.
The honestly, like the role of friend is the one I like the most, but I always feel the tug of responsibility like somewhat seeming to conflict with that. But then kind of thinking about that and realizing that no, it fits in. But I love the moments where I don't feel like I need to be teaching them anything in that moment, or like disciplining them or anything, but we're all just hanging out. And there's moments, it's kind of like getting into a flow state with the kids where it's like they're just buddies, you know? And that's my favorite.
Yeah, like when all the relationship elements line up and everybody's in a good place.
Exactly.
Everybody's got their needs met. Everybody's doing great. We're just kind of being together.
It's like the flow state of a family flow. I think we just came up with something right there.
There it is. Yeah.
How about you?
Yeah, you know, I think as a dad, the part I'm really enjoying right now is kind of like you talked about in terms of being a friend. But there's this like really interesting boundary testing that I feel like happens all the time. And so the part I like as a dad is like at 2, boundary testing is like, hey, don't put your foot in the water. And then it's like, I'm going to put my foot in the water and see what you do. Right? Like that's boundary testing at that age. And that's like interesting and funny at times and super frustrating and terrible at other times, right? Where you're just like, what are you doing, kid? You know? And now it's like so oldest is 11, going to be 12 in a month. It's like the boundary testing is really different and it's way more complicated and it's more gray. So there's just a lot more like, okay, well, let's talk about what that experience is for you. How are you feeling about that? Like whatever, but they can cognitively meet you there. And it's the first time as a parent that they can they can join you in the complexity of what's happening. And that to me has been really fun. That's been really fun.
That's really interesting because it's kind of like I remember one of my earliest memories is actually when I must have been 3 or 4, and it was my mom telling me not to touch the iron. And I was, I'm going to touch it, and then she's okay, and she let me touch it. Burn my hand. But yeah, it's funny how that's one way to show the boundary. But it's like it makes me think of Stephen Covey's progression from dependence to independence to interdependence. And we all start dependent on somebody. And so it's like when our children are super young, we feel the need, and really it's our responsibility to tell them what the boundaries are for very specific things, like things related to safety and basic rules that all humans have to live by when it comes to how to interact in public. But as they get older, I started thinking it was interesting as you talked about meeting them cognitively at what that border is and exploring it together. Because at some point they have to leave the autonomous zone that is Dave's house, right? And go plant their flag somewhere else. And so they kind of have new boundaries in some ways.
Well, they're learning how to set their own container, right? Like they're learning how to say, okay, you taught me what your boundaries are at your house. I understand those boundaries. I'm aware of those boundaries. I tested them for myself. I tried it on. I pushed a little bit here. I crossed that one. Right. And now I'm going into my own place. What are the boundaries that I want to have?
Right.
But it's going to be informed by their dependent state, right? Like where they were as a dependent, like look both ways when you cross the street.
Yeah.
They're probably forever going to look both ways because that's an obvious one.
Because we can all get hit by a car, but we don't all have the same mindset about things, which is the life that we are going to create for ourselves, right? So it's like we teach our kids about boundaries, but also about the process of creating boundaries. And then what's interesting is, so then they'll leave the house and they'll become independent and be able to become a fully, autonomous operating adult in the world. But then one day they'll want to create their own family too, maybe. Yeah. And if they do, then they're going to have to say, okay, I've got my boundaries. This person that I want to share an ideal with, share a common mission with, common goals with in a family, they have their own boundaries. So now we got to, what's the word in politics? Like gerrymander our boundaries
Yeah.
and create a new one. And that's interdependence, right? And then when
Yeah.
you have kids and then they become your friends, they have boundaries too. And it's all just this, it's like an amoeba life form of just constantly changing boundaries in this great big pool that we live in.
Yeah. And the word that comes to my mind when you say boundaries in that way is frameworks, right? So like a framework in that sense is a container. It's a boundary, but within that container, there's still room to modify and change and shift and push into. And it's, I think, a piece of, kind of tying that then into the I got this framework, right? Like there's a lot of opportunity to say, hey, this is a structure that we know that is based on science, that is, has evidence and research and, a lot of study, testing, et cetera, has gone into understanding how the human brain works. And this framework is really a container, right? It's a way to say, okay, here's an avenue that you can go in, and you have a lot of opportunity to own it. You have a lot of opportunity to make it your own. And I think, that's where the power of a framework can unlock things for folks, is in that piece. I'm curious to hear kind of your thoughts on that piece.
Well, yeah, because, we talk about boundaries that we all share, and that as parents, we feel like we need to teach, like don't touch the iron, or, look both ways. Because there's certain experiences that we all share. And in a way, that's what culture is too, just to kind of sidetrack into a bigger view of it. Like, our generation knows exactly what it feels like or what it felt like to walk through a Blockbuster on a Friday night. And that's something that our kids will never experience, right? Or like even comprehend the idea of like, why would you go to a store to pick out a movie? That makes no sense. But there are these shared experiences. As humans, every human in the world, we're basically the same. Like we're 99% the same when it comes to our DNA. But that tiny percent of difference is what makes the world seem like such a diverse pool of people and experiences. And that 1% is what makes life beautiful. But I think it's also helpful to understand the vast majority of where we're the same and learn from that. So the framework that we have here at The Ideal Life is the I Got This framework, which is based on the reward systems that all humans share, which were crafted during the evolutionary process, right? And no matter what your own boundaries look like or what your own life looks like, it's still anchored in the same chemical processes that occur inside the same organs and the same systems that we all share. And so we can learn from each other on how you implement your own reward structure and the things that you do in your life. Those things look different than the things that I care about in my life, but they're anchored on the same chemical processes that are occurring. And so our framework really tries to use evidence-based theory to identify what that biology is, what those physiological processes are, and try to streamline how we can frame our actions, our thoughts, our behaviors around that framework so that we can start from a platform and a boundary that we all share. And then from that platform, build our own structure, our own boundaries that can take advantage of our 1% differences on the strength of our 99%, what we share in common. And that's the power of it.
Yeah. I mean, I really like what you're saying there around the autonomous piece, right? Like that's the piece of like, hey, there's a framework, there's some boundaries that are evidence-based, that are studied. And in some ways we're leveraging that information to be able to experience our own joy in our own way, right? So you mentioned, you and I are different. We're going to interpret how we engage in that framework a little differently. It's like raising our kids, right? Like they're going to go off into their own space and they're going to think about like, well, dad did it this way, or mom did it this way, or they did it collectively this way. But I kind of like it a little bit like this. Like I don't live in the same house that my parents lived in. We don't operate exactly the same way. I definitely got a lot of value and learned a lot of amazing things from them, but I don't have the same house, right? To your point, like, now my spouse and I have to mesh our two systems together and then explore what it means for us, but it's still a foundational framework that's at play.
Yeah, I hope there's a lot of things that my kids do that are different than what I did.
Go Tigers.
But, yeah, they'll probably be a lot better off. But yeah, no, exactly. It's interesting and fascinating, really, to look at all the different things that we can do with the same processes that we have inside.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one thing I want to pick up in that conversation, as we talk about frameworks, there's something I think that's really important in understanding, there's the chemical side of things that are releasing in the brain, right? And that's the evidence-based, that's the theory behind it. That's like, okay, that's the point of the framework, is to get to that release that we can experience more joy.
Mm-hmm.
In that, though, we've got this kind of like finite and infinite game thing going on. Finite being like, this piece has an end, right? Like, I know if I do X, dopamine will release,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, or if I do this, it will result in this chemical transaction in my brain. And there's also this infinite piece that's tied to that, right? So that means, well, if I'm shooting for the long term, if I'm shooting for the ideal, which shouldn't have an end if we're doing it right? Like, that's an infinite game that I'm playing, but I have these finite triggers that are taking place during that process that keep me interested and connected to the infinite game. So in some ways, we're kind of playing an infinite game that has finite measures to it that keeps us interested in the infinite.
Yeah, and it's like that dichotomy of the big picture versus what I'm doing today, right? And it's where those things meet that allows us to experience life in the most fulfilling way possible. It's like those moments we have a need to feel like we're moving towards a purpose, but we all experience those moments in our life where we feel lost and disconnected from that mission, from that meaning. And what do we do in those moments where we feel disconnected? And that's where, when we dive into what we're doing today and the decisions that we can make today, that can ground us back into getting reoriented and realigned. And the natural result of that realignment will be an increase in the chemicals that make us want to feel connected with that purpose anyway, if that makes sense. So sometimes it's enough to contemplate the person we want to be. Sometimes we have to live in today. And it's where those two ideas meet that we kind of have a sense of our life and the story that we're writing over time.
Well, so talk a little bit more about the alignment piece, because I think that's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So the opposite of alignment would be misalignment. So maybe talk a little bit about what alignment looks like, and maybe a little bit about what misalignment looks like.
And this idea of alignment is one that really has gone back to the original philosophers who thought about what the meaning of life is anyway. So Aristotle, who was the first one to say that the purpose of life is to be happy, used the idea of alignment to discuss what a virtue is and how a person should live in general. And the way he did that was through what he called the rule of the golden mean. And so what is a virtue? Aristotle said that it is the center point between two vices. And so, for example, courage is a virtue. But if you are just rash in the way that you go into dangerous environments, that's actually a vice. And I think he called that like being brash, or being, I forget the word that he used.
I think he talked about recklessness.
Recklessness, maybe, yeah. But on the other side, you don't want to be too timid, because then you're going to miss out on things that you could have done in your own life, but also, ways that you need to stand up for others or protect others, or everything you think about when you think about courage, right?
Yeah.
So what's interesting about that is
all things in moderation, right? Like,
exactly. Yeah. And there's a balance there. And so when you can align your actions in the middle, that's when you're hitting virtue. You can't do that all the time. It's this idea of perfection. But it also relieves some pressure when you think about alignment, because just because you're not perfect, which none of us are, you can still think about yourself as closer to the center versus farther away. And then in your lack of perfection and your imperfections, you can still be very good. And at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to be good people in general. And so Aristotle talked about this idea of aligning your vices. And in that alignment, you reach virtue, which is very interesting. And then when you get into modern day psychology, you see the same discussions about alignment that are very similar to the discussions that we were having thousands of years ago. Not much has changed. So Freud is an example. Freud is known for a lot of things, but one of the ideas of his that is really stuck is his theory of the subconscious. And he divided our mind into three distinct parts: the id, the ego, and the superego, which he also referred to as the ego ideal. And that's one of the places where we get the word ideal from in our own framework. What he said was the id, which we can now think about as the limbic system of our brain, the amygdala, the emotional parts of our body, of our brain and body, as the needs that we all have for survival as a race, the things that we have to get. We have to get food, we have to procreate, we need those things. And so the id is fully subconscious, and it is always trying to get what the species needs. The problem with that is that that's not always appropriate for the real world. So think about food. The id is going to see the plate of chocolate cake walking by on the waiter's platter, and it's going to say, I want that cake. But if you were to just reach over and knock the waiter over and grab that piece of cake that was going to the guy at the table, you might have some problems,
riot. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so the ego is the part of the brain that hears what the id is saying it needs, and it's also monitoring the external environment, and it's saying, okay, what's the best way to fulfill the id's request? And so maybe that is to wait politely, and as the waiter walks back, flag him down and say, sir, may I please also order a piece of chocolate cake? And they would happily bring it to you, and then you could eat it. It is happy. And a lot of times that's what we end up doing. But there's the third part of the brain, which is the super ego, or the ego ideal. And that's our conscious. And that's saying that what is the best thing that we can do based on what our image is in our head of the person that we should be. And so the ego hears the id saying, I want that chocolate cake, but maybe it hears the ego ideal saying, you probably shouldn't be having that slice of cake because remember, you're supposed to be losing 5 pounds. And so the ego has this job of managing 3 different voices: the voice of the id, our limbic emotional system of what we need, the voice of the ego ideal, which is our prefrontal cortex conscious, and then the voice of the environment, what's actually okay given our social norms. And so there, the idea of alignment is, how can all 3 of those voices be the same? And when that happens, when our id, what we need, is aligned with what we should do, and aligned with what's acceptable in society, that's alignment. And the ego can then shrink because it doesn't have to be big and bossy to keep everybody in line. It can shrink to a normal size. And what does it mean when the ego shrinks or doesn't shrink? It's how it defends against misalignment. So that's where we get defense mechanisms from, rationalizing things, catastrophizing, things like that. And so when you can find alignment, then you are able to have a healthier size ego, which actually makes you more open and less likely to have these defense mechanisms. So we've talked about Aristotle and his alignment between 2 vices is virtue. We've talked about Freud. The alignment between id and the ego ideal is a healthier ego. And then Carl Rogers, another psychologist, he talked about alignment between our actual self and our ideal self. So again, this idea of the ideal. And what he said is that every person has this image in their mind of who they are today, but they also have an image in their mind of the person they should be. In other words, the ego ideal, the superego, same thing. And you can think of the actual self as like the ego's perception of where we are. So what Rogers said is, the more those 2 overlap, and the more we perceive that they're continuing to move closer to each other, the higher our self-worth and self-esteem will be. So think about 2 twins, both weigh the exact same, and both have the same image of what their fitness should look like. So let's say they both weigh 200 pounds, and they both see their ideal weight of being 185. Standing on the scale, they weigh the exact same, but one of the twins looks at that scale and thinks to himself, I'm worthless. I'll never be able to stick with a diet. I'll never be able to hit my ideal weight. The other twin looks at their scale and sees the same weight, but says, I know today I'm going to take these actions to lower my calorie intake or exercise more. And so I feel like I'm moving towards my ideal weight. If you look at this Venn diagram of their actual self and their ideal self, it's the same level of overlap that they have, but one is moving closer towards the ideal self because they know that it's within their control to lose the weight, and the other one is moving farther away because they feel like it's out of their control. The twin who has a plan is going to have higher self-worth. So you see in all different areas of the psychological pursuit of what it means to have a happy life, this idea of alignment, from Aristotle to Freud to Carl Rogers. And what we try to do today with the I Got This framework is to identify what that ego ideal is, to get that on paper through identifying the ideal, and then saying through the way that we set our goals and objectives and tasks to take action today to move towards that ideal, we know that that is the best thing we can do to move our actual self towards our ideal self, which will create alignment. And that alignment will allow our ego to shrink, because what we need and what we should do are closer to the same thing. And the result of that is higher self-esteem, higher self-worth, less defense mechanisms, and on the inside, a release of chemicals, dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins that give us this subjective feeling of happiness. So that's really what it's about, is creating alignment to achieve those psychological things.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I you know, just to pull it down to potentially like a real world example, right? Of like when your car is misaligned, like when your wheel alignment isn't on, you know, and the steering wheel is shaking in your hands, it's kind of like that experience of feeling like, okay, who I am and who I should be aren't in alignment, and it's disruptive and it's like obvious, right? Like you can feel it.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, I think about that example with the car of, you know, the wheel is shaking. It feels like it's out of control a little bit, right? And I think about the same thing when we think about life alignment of like, oh, there's this thing that I know, like there's this potential that I have, there's this thing I'm supposed to be, and man, I'm not doing it. That's where like the lack of confidence, the emptiness, the anxiety, the frustration, the like, man, what am I doing with my life? Like all these, you know, kind of deep philosophical questions can come from, you know, and I think it is that like that experience of the wheel shaking in our hands is kind of what misalignment feels like. And alignment is everything's smooth, everything's kind of rolling. It doesn't mean we're not going to hit a bump in the road on occasion and feel that like, you know, I gotta get back into center. So, you know, when you think about the maintenance side of that, so just kind of play that car analogy a little bit further, like when you think about the maintenance of it, right? Like we're going to get out of alignment at times, right? Like we're going to lose sight of the ideal. We're going to lose sight of the path. We're going to lose sight of, you know, okay, this action that I'm taking, like what does maintenance look like when it comes to alignment? Because we can establish a framework. We can say, this is where I want to go. This is who I am. You know, I start working on going from 200 to 185. I've got my plan. You know, I'm figuring that out. But what happens when I fall off track? Like, how do I maintain that?
That's and I love the analogy you make there of the shake that you feel when your tires misaligned, because we feel it when we're misaligned, and the way we feel it, as you mentioned, is through a general sense of anxiety. These thoughts about I'm not with it today. I'm not feeling my best. I feel down about myself. Sometimes it's very subtle and it's just kind of the overwhelming reality of life. And then we've all had times where it becomes more acute and we hit bouts of really bad anxiety. I know I've dealt with anxiety that's led all the way down into depression, and sometimes it can get really bad. But that general shake is something that we all experience every day, right? Yeah. And what's going on inside the body, that's cortisol. That is the stress hormone. So when our fight or flight system goes into place, it's because we're having a goal threatened. And deep down, that's a survival threat. Like if a lion jumps out of a bush and tries to eat you, that lion is threatening your goal of survival. And cortisol is immediately released to coordinate our fight or flight system, which also involves adrenaline, norepinephrine. But that energy system replaces the goal-driven energy system of dopamine and results in that stress. So so that drip of cortisol is something we all experience. And I think it's a beautiful analogy you referenced to the wheels being misaligned. Because again, it comes back to alignment. So how can we maintain that alignment is your question. And again, the I Got This framework is designed to do exactly that. So just a consistent coming back to the framework on a regular basis every week and just looking at it. So again, we have this idea of our actual self, who we are today, and our ideal self, who we want to be at the end of our life, the story that we're writing, and how are those aligned. And so we start with the ideal and the framework, and then we work our way back and we say, well, what are some uncontrollable goals, like the big goals we all have in life that would move me closer towards that milestone? So let's say we have an ideal of, like personally for me, I have an ideal health idea where I want to be present with my great grandchildren, meaning I want to get down on the ground and play with them, get down on my knees, be able to get back up, hold them in my arms for as long as I can. You know, when I'm 90 years old, I'd like to be able to do that. What are some goals that I would need to hit in the meantime to make sure that that's going to become a reality? Well, I need a stronger core if I'm going to be able to get up and down like that. I already have a bad back because I have a herniated disc, so I need to focus even more on my core. So maybe I set a goal of being able to do a certain amount at a certain weight of Turkish get-ups, something that you need a strong core to get to. So I'll set a goal. Whether or not I hit that goal is somewhat uncontrollable, but I can control the amount of exercise and the amount of diet I do to be able to put myself in a position to do that. So we set an uncontrollable goal, like a certain number of reps at a certain weight of Turkish get-ups. And then what we do is we take the controllable action out of that goal, and that's our objective. So maybe my objective is to show up 5 days a week and do 15 Turkish get-ups, and I plan out the weight increments I need to build up to. I can control that. But then evidence shows that the best way to deliberately practice an objective is to break it into bite-sized pieces so that we get just a little bit out of our comfort zone, but not too much to where we burn out. So then I'll say, okay, what am I doing today or this week? Well, I'm doing 15 reps at 10-pound kettlebell weight for a Turkish get-up. So now I know what I'm doing today as I'm showing up this morning, and I'm going to take that weight kettlebell, and I'm going to do 15 reps of Turkish get-up. But I've also done the planning through the I Got This framework, where if I do that today and I know what I'm going to increase to next week, and I know that if I do that, that's going to put me in the best position to reach my goal. And if I reach that goal, that will move me closer towards my ideal of being able to play with my great-grandchildren when I'm 90. Then what I've done is I've created alignment between the action I'm taking today and the person I want to be in the future. Now I'm looking at my Venn diagram of my actual self versus my ideal self. I'm seeing the gap, but I'm also seeing that the gap is moving closer together. The gap is shrinking. Chemicals are releasing in my mind, dopamine because I'm pursuing a goal, the oxytocin and serotonin that will come with thinking about the reason for the goal, bonding with my family, the respect that I'll have for myself from accomplishing it, and then getting out of my comfort zone on a regular basis is going to naturally release endorphins that are going to mask some of that pain and feel good too. So I'm getting all four of the dose chemicals, and then as I pursue that on a consistent basis, I'm going to develop new skills, new muscle development. And when I hit those periods of growth, I'll enter into flow states where I get all the chemicals at the same time. And collectively, that experience of going through that and raising the bar little by little, I'm getting access to all the chemicals I need to be happy. And it's all because of the alignment from my task to the ideal through the goals and objectives.
Yes, I want to pick up on a couple of things you said there. So the alignment between kind of the ideal and your action is really where the dopamine, the oxytocin, serotonin, endorphin release comes from, right? Like that's where the joy comes from, is knowing that you're on the path to something bigger, but the day-to-day actions that you're doing is allowing that to happen. So I want to pick up on that. And I just want to be clear. So dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, endorphins, we call that dose, right? So DOSE, dose, is the initials for those. So just want to state that clearly. We call them dose conversations or dose meetings. The reason we call them that is because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to draw that connection between, hey, here's the ideal, here's what I'm doing. Let's find that thread. Let's find that thread line between day-to-day action. Here's what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. And here's how that allows us to play with our grandkids when we're 90 years old. Right?
That's right. And we talk about the dose chemicals, and I've thrown out some other things in this conversation, like flow states and what occurs during those, where we get all the dose chemicals at once. On our, the other conversations that we have on this podcast, but also on our YouTube channel and our blog, we dive into that a lot more. But at a high level, each one of those dose chemicals happen for different reasons.
Yeah.
But collectively, they make up, just those 4 chemicals, the vast majority, if not the entirety, of what our subjective feelings of happiness are. No matter what different things make us happy, they dial down on brain scans into the same chemicals, which is amazing. But dopamine is it's referred to as the feel good hormone, or the happy hormone. But that's it's is responsible for a lot of different things. So it's responsible to coordinate movement. Whenever we want to move our muscles, dopamine, so the actual chemical is acetylcholine that makes it happen, but dopamine is essentially the chemical that tells acetylcholine to get going. And so that's why Parkinson's disease, which is a lack of dopamine, has the tremors associated with it, because it's a lack of dopamine.
Is there any relationship there with joy and happiness? I'm curious if it's just the physical version of, like, how dopamine plays into the physical there is obvious, right? But does it also have an effect on the emotional state?
Well, when dopamine is released, we feel good. It feels very good to have dopamine.
Yeah.
But we're constantly, it's like this idea of, if you do something, now you have dopamine. And if you're not doing that thing, you don't have any dopamine. We're getting dopamine constantly. It's like it's firing, and there's a part of the brain between the prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of our brain, and the feeling part of our brain, where dopamine is produced and where it gets released, and the nucleus accumbens.
Yeah.
And it's, if you think about it right now, it's like it's constantly going like dopamine getting released. And when we do goal-related dopamine enhancing activities, you can think about it like going to it's like increasing a lot. And so it's a dopamine deficiency. If you're balanced dopamine, if you're just kind of doing things that like we're just sitting here, if we're not thinking about a goal, we're still going to be getting dopamine, and we're going to be used to that amount. So it's not necessarily going to feel good. So as we move around, we're not necessarily getting this super good feeling of dopamine. But as we increase it from baseline, it's that gap from baseline to the increase that feels really, really good. So dopamine, it's tied to our movement. It's also tied to our memory. Whenever we have a memory, it's because dopamine was released, and that flags our brain to store a memory. And so, we talk about other conversations, which I would commend the listener to check out, is how you can control your memories through strategic dopamine release. But when you think about it, the fact that dopamine is the most rewarding and feel-good chemical makes sense when you think about memory and movement. Because if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, if you are in a tribe and you stumble across a new water source, you move towards a new water source, that is a big deal, because that increases significantly the likelihood that your tribe will survive in the future. And so you want to remember where it is, but you also want to be able to move back to your tribe and bring them back so that they know where it is, right? So this idea of movement and memory is tied to survival. And so dopamine is what motivates us to pursue those things that keep us alive. And that's why it feels so good. And so the way the brain says, I'm going to release dopamine or not, is through the idea of goals. And so goals are intentions that our attention sets. So we have to focus our attention on something, and then have an intent for that thing to result in some kind of outcome. That's what constitutes a goal.
Okay, so in the same way then, like I might have hunter-gatherer sense of the term, right? We're talking about movement. Dopamine release is when I find the water source for my tribe, right? So my goal might have been, hey, survival. I need to find a water source. I find a water source. Boom, I'm excited. I get the endorphins. I want to go back and tell my tribe. So I get, the oxytocin, serotonin kind of element, because I'm in relationship. I'm getting that respect, right? Like I'm actually probably getting the full dose at that point. But does a goal in modern day times, right? Like water comes from a faucet for the vast majority of us, right? Does a goal work in the same sense then, right? Like I'm essentially creating, I need to find water, right? Like I need to find this thing, or I need to create this thing. So you're talking about attention, right? So like we have the luxury in modern day times to be able to pick something, right? To be able to choose out of thin air. This is the thing I want to do. Or like, this is the goal that I have, because water for most of us, isn't necessarily something we have to worry too much about. But, that goal setting piece, thinking about, okay, so I'm just picking something. I'm putting my attention somewhere. That works the same way then.
It does. And that's the beauty of the reward systems that we have in our body, is that they evolve through our need for survival and reproduction. But we live, most of us, and we all hope to live longer, much longer than our reproductive age, or our time when we reproduce. So we have a purpose greater than just surviving long to reproduce. Now, what that purpose is something that all of us grapple with throughout our life. But the fact is that we do exist longer than that evolutionary goal. But the beauty of it is that the reward systems remain the same. And so when we have a survival intent, like eating food, as we think about taking actions to achieve that goal, dopamine is released. As we are completing those actions, dopamine is released. But the interesting thing is that once that action is done, the body has what it needs from us. And so dopamine release goes away related to that specific goal. And that's the real impact of the I Got This framework, is addressing the challenge that last piece of the equation has. So if you think about eating food, that's related to a survival goal. When you think about eating food, dopamine is released. That makes you motivated to find food and eat it. As you're eating the food, it feels pleasurable. That's dopamine again, and also some other chemicals, but dopamine is a big player there. But the purpose of eating the food is to transfer the energy from the food into your cells. And that happens during digestion, and unless something's gone wrong, you're not aware of that at all. So the same thing again happens in these goals that we set for our life outside of survival. Like, take the midlife crisis, for example. We set these goals for ourselves as we start our career, but then as we approach retirement age, or any point along there, once we realize that the goals that we set, either we're already achieving them, or maybe we never will for whatever reason, the role of those goals as a dopamine generating idea erodes, because either we've already achieved it, or we know we're about to. And that's where the energy from dopamine gets replaced by the fight or flight energy of cortisol, and we start to have really anxious feelings about what we're doing in our career.
That's the threat you referred to earlier, right?
Right.
So like, we no longer, generally speaking, have lions and tigers, climbing up behind us, but the threat is, okay, I've found the water hole, I've approached the goal, I've gotten to the goal, now what?
Yeah.
The threat is, now what?
Exactly, because it's at the most basic level, goals are how we survive. But you made the point that life's a lot different than it was when we were living in a cave.
Yeah.
But the way our body is designed doesn't really know the difference. And so whatever goal you set for yourself, the hardware of your brain is saying, okay, this must be related to my survival. And so if you get misaligned with that goal for whatever reason, or if that goal expires because you've completed it, then you're essentially telling your body you're in danger, because that goal, either you don't have a goal at all, or the goal isn't going to be able to be completed. And that's a scary place to be.
Yeah. Okay. So to play that down the line a couple steps. So let's say we've got 3 goals a quarter, big goals, right? Like 90-day, we've got these 3 goals, or 10 goals, or 7 goals, or whatever, like whatever the number is, and you're going to hit all of them. You feel really good. Hey, I'm going to hit all 7 goals. Or like a sales goal, right? Like, hey, you're going to sell $100,000 this quarter, whatever the number is. Okay. So then you get it. And the way I think about this is like, then if I achieve this goal of $100,000 in this quarter, next quarter, it's going to be 120.
Yeah.
Right. Like, all right, well, this goal is just either going to get harder, bigger, tougher. Like, the goals don't stop, right? Like, just, in a work environment in particular, right? Like, all right, what's the next thing? What's the next thing? What's the next thing? So that is, in some ways, that's tied to the threat then, right?
And that's the premise of the hedonic treadmill. And we can dive into that. But, the example you just made, I was coaching a sales team within a very large multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical company. And in that industry, as others in sales, this idea of a quota is a big deal.
Yeah.
And so, you have a quota passed down to you from above, from the powers that be,
Yeah.
and they say, okay, you need to sell 100 prescriptions this quarter or this month or whatever it is. And you do great, and you sell 105 because it's the best quarter you've ever had, and the market dynamics were right, and all the stars aligned, and you win over quota.
Yeah.
But then the powers that be see the 105 and go, oh, well, let's bump that up 20% because we got numbers to hit. And then so they come back and they say that now you need to be at, whatever that is, 120. Yeah. And you go, oh my goodness, that was the best. How could I ever do that? And so much anxiety comes from the idea that the goal is too far away from reality. And we came in and we coached this team with the I Got This framework. And the manager afterwards came back and said, the reason I know this is working with my team is not just because we just hit number 1 in the country in prescriptions. And it's not just because all my employees are saying that they're more engaged than they've ever been. But this quarter is the first time in my career when quotas came out, I received 0 text from my sales representatives complaining about what the quota was because they were no longer concerned about what's next or what's more. They were content with the path that they controlled towards how they saw their ideal version of their job. And that alignment masked the cortisol that came from the uncontrollable because they had taken the control of their path internally. And that was really rewarding feedback for me to hear. But we can dive, if you want, into the hedonic treadmill if you like. And
so just to pick up on that then, right? So the hedonic treadmill is the sense of like, okay, so I achieved this goal, next goal, next goal, next goal, next goal, and this goal cycle never ends, right? And maybe there's a play in there too about what we were talking about with, infinite and finite things, right? Like goals are time bound. They have a finite in modern work world, right? Like they're time bound. It's not like, oh, your goal is endless. Do it whenever you want. Like no manager says that to any one of their employees, right? Like there's always a time version of it, and there's always going to be another one. And then we have a performance review, and then there's another one, and so on and so forth.
And you bring up this really interesting idea of time, right?
Yeah.
And so what makes the human species different from any other animal, if psychologists could identify one thing, it's the ability to see into the future and into the past. And that's an ability unique to the prefrontal cortex. And human beings have a significantly larger prefrontal cortex than any other animal. And in a sense, it's what makes us human, is this part of our brain, which rests right behind our forehead. When we see into the future and connect a goal with our current actions, that's when dopamine is released. So dopamine is this forward-looking chemical, right?
Yep.
We also have these other chemicals that are dependent on the here and now, on our senses. And the major ones there are oxytocin and serotonin. When our senses detect that we have satisfied our need for bonding, we predominantly get oxytocin as a reward. And when our senses notice in this immediate time that we've achieved our needs for respect and uniqueness, that's when we get serotonin. So oxytocin and serotonin are these ideas that we have achieved a need from our immediate environment. And then the last chemical of the dose is endorphins, and that's also a here and now chemical. Endorphins are released whenever cortisol is released. And when we get out of our comfort zone through deliberate practice, we release just enough cortisol to introduce enough stress to provide focus towards improvement by stretching ourselves, but we also get endorphins released. So again, I'm
going to earmark the stress part of that.
Yeah.
It's because I think there's a big nugget in there. So I'm just going to hold on to that.
Well, I'll wrap up quickly. And so just tying the I Got This framework, the IGOT to the DOSE, the top of that, the ideal, is the most forward-looking element.
Yeah.
And that's where we get most of our dopamine, is through alignment with that ideal. The goals.
And the ideal is that infinite goal. We're looking for something that doesn't have an end. It's a big picture, something we're shooting for.
Something we can shoot for that we'll never actually achieve, but we'll always be motivated to pursue. And we can dive a little bit more into the elements of that if you want. The goal are the uncontrollable things that we will sense in our outside of us, in our environment, that tell us we did good or not, and achieving our bonding or respect needs
Mm.
of being part of a tribe. And that's where we get our oxytocin or serotonin. And then the OT part are the controllable elements.
Yeah.
So the objective is the controllable element broken into bite-sized pieces of the tasks. That's where we can choose and control getting a certain amount out of our comfort zone in that ideal zone. And when we do that, we know that we're going to get endorphins. And so when you follow the I Got This framework, not only are you creating alignment from your task to your ideal, from your actions to your purpose, but you're also strategically making sure through the ideal, through the goals, and through the objectives and tasks that you're getting incremental hits of dopamine, oxytocin, and serotonin and endorphins along the way. I would say that if people want to dive more into the nuances of what we're talking about so that they can learn to take control of it in their life, follow us on this blog, subscribe. It really helps us to get the message out. Check us out on our YouTube channel and invite people into the ideal tribe. Because what we're really trying to do here is to create an equal playing field for everybody in the world and to spread the love that is shared ideals and tribes, and to connect with the fact that all humans across this planet, no matter what country or race or religion they are, we're all designed the same way. Almost 100%, almost. And it's that little piece that we aren't that makes us so different and unique and special, in the world a very unboring place to live. But there's so much that we can do to connect and make ourselves better through the deliberate practice of shared goals. See you next time.